Richard Carter's hand shook as he reached for the wine glass. He never noticed that I had switched it back. The room was silent except for the low hum of the air conditioner and the distant ticking of Walter Bishop's antique grandfather clock. My father, Charleston, shipping magnate family patriarch, and the man who had spent 38 years reminding me that I should have been born a son, lifted the crystal to his lips and drank. 3 seconds later his face drained white. 5 seconds later his fingers loosened around the stem. The glass shattered across the Persian rug. And 7 seconds later my father collapsed at the reading of my mother's will. That was the moment I understood my mother had known exactly what kind of man she had married. And she had planned for this. 3 days earlier I had buried her. Charleston in late October carries a kind of softness that makes grief feel almost disrespectful. The live oaks drip Spanish moss like old lace, and the harbor breeze smells faintly of salt and magnolia. It was the kind of weather my mother loved. She used to say Charleston knew how to mourn properly, quietly, with dignity. The funeral had been held at St. Philip's, the same church where my parents had married 42 years ago. I stood at the graveside in my navy dress, blues shoulders, squared eyes dry. I'd learned long ago that some grief was too deep for tears. Mother had always loved seeing me in uniform. Even when my father sneered that I looked like a child playing soldier, she would smile and straighten my collar. "You wear honor beautifully, Abigail." She'd said that the last time I saw her healthy enough to stand. Those words had stayed with me through deployments, combat zones, and nights when loneliness felt heavier than body armor. Across the cemetery, my father stood rigid beneath a black umbrella, though no rain had fallen. Beside him was my brother Preston, his expression carefully arranged into something resembling sorrow. Preston had inherited our father's height and polished charm. At 35, he looked every inch the heir apparent to Carter Maritime Logistics, our family's shipping company that had built half its fortune moving cargo through Charleston Harbor. Father had spent Preston's entire life grooming him for leadership. And he'd spent mine explaining why leadership was wasted on daughters. When I was 10, I'd beaten every boy at the yacht club regatta. Father's response had been immediate. "You've embarrassed them enough, Abigail. Learn some grace." When Preston came dead last 2 weeks later, Father bought him a new sailboat and called it character building. Mother had waited until bedtime that night, sitting on the edge of my bed in our old Battery mansion. "He doesn't understand what strength looks like in women," she'd said softly. "Then why did you marry him?" She'd smiled sadly. "Because people often reveal who they are too late." I understood those words better now. After the funeral, I'd stayed in Charleston because Walter Bishop had called. Walter had been the Carter family attorney for nearly 40 years. He was 76 now, with silver hair and the measured voice of a man who'd spent his life delivering difficult truths. "Your mother's will is to be read Monday afternoon," he'd said. She was very specific that all immediate family attend. There had been something strained in his voice. Enough to make me notice. And in my line of work, noticing kept you alive. I flew missions for naval special warfare, reading subtle changes in expression, posture, breathing that wasn't paranoia. It was training. And Walter sounded uneasy. So Monday afternoon I drove through Charleston's historic district to his office on Broad Street, with my instincts already humming. The old building stood exactly as it always had: red brick, white columns, brass plaque, polished bright enough to mirror your face. Inside, the receptionist offered condolences in that practiced Southern way that sounded warm but revealed nothing. Walter's office smelled faintly of old leather and cedar polish. Father was already there. He stood by the windows overlooking the street, broad-shouldered, even at 68, his navy suit immaculate. He turned when I entered. For half a second, something unreadable crossed his face. Then it vanished. "Abigail." No warmth, no acknowledgement of the funeral 3 days before. Just my name, flat and formal. Preston sat beside the conference table, scrolling through his phone. He looked up with a quick smile. "Abby." No one had called me Abby since high school except him. I hated it. "Preston." He pocketed the phone and stood to kiss my cheek. His cologne was too expensive and too strong. He smelled exactly as he always had, polished and artificial. Father gestured toward the chair opposite them. "Sit down, Walter should begin shortly." That was all. No mention of mother. No grief. No humanity. Just business. I sat. The conference room was lined with dark walnut bookshelves and family portraits dating back to men who had built fortunes from ships and cotton and inherited certainty like property. No women. Just stern Carter men staring down from gilded frames. Mother had once joked she should haunt the room just to annoy them. I almost smiled remembering it. Then Walter entered carrying a leather portfolio. His face looked pale. He greeted each of us, but when his eyes met mine, something sharpened there. A warning. Then his assistant followed, carrying a silver tray with 4 crystal glasses of red wine. Father smiled faintly. Your mother always believed difficult conversations deserved good Bordeaux. It was the first affectionate thing he'd said about her all day. And somehow that made it worse. Walter hesitated. Just briefly. Then nodded to the tray. Mrs. Carter requested this specifically. That was when my instincts stirred. Mother hadn't drunk red wine in 15 years. Not after her chemotherapy. Why would she request this? I watched Father's hand as he lifted his glass. Steady. Too steady. And when he set it down again, his fingers lingered near mine. Long enough to shift its position. A small movement. Subtle. Easy to miss. But not by me. The glass now sitting before me had originally been his. My pulse slowed. Training. Focus. Observe. Do not react. Then my phone vibrated. Unknown number. The room went still. Father's eyes flicked toward it. Just for a fraction too long. I rose calmly. Excuse me. And stepped into the hall to answer. Static filled the line. No voice. No breathing. Nothing. Then the call disconnected. When I turned back toward Walter's office, he was already standing there. Waiting. His face had gone grave. He leaned close enough that only I could hear. And whispered. Whatever you do, don't drink the glass on your left. I stared at him. Then slowly reached for the brass doorknob and walked back inside. No expression. No hesitation. And quietly switched the glasses back. Then Father lifted his wine. And drank. The crystal stem clicked softly against my father's wedding ring as he lifted the glass. For one strange second, I noticed that sound more clearly than anything else in the room. Not Walter's sudden intake of breath. Not Preston shifting uneasily in his chair. Not even the low hiss of traffic outside Broad Street's old windows. Just that tiny sound of crystal meeting gold. Then Richard Carter drank. He took a long swallow, the kind he always took when he wanted to appear perfectly at ease. The kind of swallow he'd practiced his whole life, the polished confidence of a Charleston businessman who believed control was something a man wore as naturally as cufflinks. He set the glass down carefully. Folded his hands. Looked toward Walter. Please proceed. His voice sounded smooth enough. But his pupils had already widened. My training noticed before anyone else did. A Navy SEAL learns to spot physical distress before panic arrives. We're taught to read subtle changes in skin tone, respiration, motor control, the body's early warnings. And my father's body was beginning to betray him. A slight stiffness in his shoulders. A tightening around the mouth. His breathing shortened. 3 seconds. 4. Then his right hand trembled. Preston noticed it first. Dad. Father's eyes widened. His left hand clawed suddenly at his throat. The crystal glass tipped and shattered across the Persian rug. Then his chair scraped backward with a violent screech as his body convulsed and hit the floor. Preston lunged up so fast his chair overturned. Jesus Christ. Walter froze. I didn't. Training overrides fear. I was beside my father before his head struck the hardwood, catching him under the shoulders and lowering him flat. His face had gone chalk white. His breathing came in ragged gasps. Not choking. Neurological impairment. Sedative toxicity. His pulse fluttered wildly beneath my fingers. Call 911, I snapped. No one moved. I looked up sharply. Now. That got Preston moving. His hands shook so badly he dropped his phone before finally dialing. Walter crouched opposite me, his expression stricken. He wasn't supposed. He stopped himself. I filed that away for later. Father's eyes rolled toward me, recognition flickered there. Then terror. For the first time in my life, Richard Carter looked genuinely afraid. Not angry. Not disappointed? Afraid. His lips parted. Abi. He had not called me that since I was 14. Then his body seized again. I stabilized his airway, tilted his head, checked respiration. Still breathing. Barely. The ambulance arrived within 7 minutes. Longest 7 minutes of Preston's life. He paced and cursed and kept saying, "This can't be happening, like repetition might alter reality." Walter stood by the windows, pale and silent. And I remained kneeling beside my father until the paramedics took over. One of them glanced at my uniform. Military. Naval Special Warfare. He gave a brisk nod of respect and moved faster. Charleston still understands uniforms. As they loaded father onto the stretcher, his eyes fluttered open. They found mine immediately. There was accusation there. And confusion. Then the doors closed. The sirens faded. And silence settled over Walter's office like dust. Preston turned on me first. His face was flushed crimson. "What the hell did you do?" I looked at him evenly. "Nothing. Don't lie to me." Walter stepped forward sharply. "That's enough." Preston rounded on him. "You told us Mother wanted this wine served. You poured it." Walter's voice stayed calm. "I did what your mother instructed. Then Abigail poisoned him." I almost laughed. Preston had always been predictable. When frightened, he attacked. When cornered, he blamed. It was the closest thing he had to character. I straightened slowly, smoothing my skirt. If I'd poisoned him, Preston, he'd be dead. The room went still. He stared at me, unsure whether that had been cruelty or simple fact. "It was both." Walter cleared his throat. "The police will likely have questions." Preston glared at me as though outrage alone might rewrite events. "Good, because this is insane." His voice cracked on the last word. And for a moment I saw something beneath his anger. Fear. Real fear. Not grief for our father. Fear for himself. Interesting. Charleston Memorial Hospital smelled exactly as all hospitals do: bleach, stale coffee, and bad news. By the time I arrived, 2 police detectives were already waiting outside Richard's ICU room. Middle-aged men in plain suits, polite but alert. Southern professionals. The older one introduced himself as Detective Mercer. "We understand you were present when Mr. Carter collapsed." "Yes." He studied me carefully. "Lieutenant Commander Carter." "Commander." A faint shift of respect. Military titles matter to men of his generation. He opened his notebook. "Walk me through what happened." So I did. Everything except Walter's warning. Not because I distrusted the police, but because instinct told me that Whisper belonged to a larger story. Mercer listened without interruption, then asked the obvious question. "You noticed your father switch the glasses?" "Yes." "Why didn't you say something?" I met his gaze steadily. "Because I wanted to know why." He considered that, then nodded slowly. He understood more than he said. His partner stepped forward. Toxicology found elevated zolpidem concentrations in his blood. Ambien. A dangerous dose. Enough to incapacitate. Possibly kill in an older man with heart issues. Not theatrical poison. Practical sedation. Planned. Mercer watched my face. "Your father was likely intended to lose consciousness quickly. Not die. Not necessarily. Just become helpless." That fit. And made the situation uglier. Because it suggested calculation, not rage. Someone had wanted me unconscious during the reading, which meant whatever happened next had mattered. And someone believed I would not wake in time to stop it. My phone buzzed. "Walter." I answered immediately. His voice was lower than usual. "You need to come back to my office." "Why?" A pause. Then, "Because your mother left something to be opened only if Richard betrayed you." Cold moved down my spine. "What exactly did she leave?" His answer came quietly. "A letter marked for Abigail only if he chooses greed." I closed my eyes, and for the first time since Mother's funeral I felt her presence clearly. Not grief. Not memory. Intention. She had known. Somehow my mother had known exactly what kind of man her husband would become after she was gone. And she had prepared for him. When I opened my eyes, Detective Mercer was watching me. "Everything all right, Commander?" I slipped the phone into my purse. No, I said honestly. Then I looked toward my father's ICU room where machines now breathed rhythmically for the strongest man I had ever feared, and realized he had finally lost control. Because my mother had made sure of it. I turned toward the elevator. Walter was waiting. And so was the truth. Walter Bishop was standing exactly where I expected him to be when I stepped back into his Broad Street office beside the old walnut desk, where he had managed Carter family affairs for nearly 4 decades, his shoulders drawn tighter than I had ever seen. The city had gone dark outside. Charleston after sunset has a hush to it, especially downtown when the tourists thin out and the old streets seem to remember themselves. Inside Walter's office, only the green banker's lamp glowed, throwing soft pools of light across the polished wood. The shattered wine glass had been cleaned. The room looked composed again, as if a man had not nearly died there an hour earlier. Walter motioned for me to sit. I remained standing. What did my mother know? He removed his glasses slowly and rubbed the bridge of his nose. At my age, Abigail, there are certain moments when a man understands his professional obligations, and his moral obligations are about to collide. Then choose quickly. His expression flickered. For a brief second, he looked amused. My mother used to say I had inherited Richard's steel but Eleanor's restraint. Apparently Walter saw it too. He opened the leather portfolio on his desk and withdrew a sealed cream envelope. Across the front in my mother's elegant handwriting were the words, "For Abigail only if Richard betrays her." My throat tightened. Even after months of chemotherapy, her penmanship had remained graceful. Precise. Deliberate. Entirely Eleanor Carter. Walter extended the envelope. She gave this to me 6 weeks before she passed. Did she explain? She said only this: if my husband finally reveals himself, my daughter will need the truth more than comfort. That sounded exactly like her. Mother had never mistaken sentimentality for love. She believed real love prepared people for reality. Even painful reality. I broke the seal carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter 3 pages long. The first line hit me like a physical blow. My dearest Abigail, if you are reading this, then your father has chosen fear over love exactly as I prayed he would not. I sat down slowly and began to read. She had known. Not guessed. Known. For nearly a year, Mother had quietly uncovered financial irregularities inside Carter Maritime Logistics. Preston had been siphoning company funds through shell vendors to cover speculative investments he'd hidden from the board. Bad ones. Very bad ones. The losses totaled nearly $11 million. And Richard had discovered it months earlier. Instead of reporting him, he covered it up. Mother had confronted him. Demanded accountability. He refused. Because exposing Preston would destroy the son he had spent 35 years convincing himself was extraordinary. So Mother had made her own arrangements. In the event of her death, Richard assumed he would gain controlling interest in the company and quietly repair Preston's damage. Instead, Mother had legally transferred majority ownership 51% to me. The paperwork had been finalized under Walter's supervision, while she was still lucid enough to sign. No one else knew. Not Richard. Not Preston. Not even the board. My stomach turned as I reached the final paragraph. Your father will try to prevent this if he learns of it before the reading. He may use charm pressure or deception. Whatever happens, trust your instincts. They have always been stronger than his pride. I lowered the pages. Walter said nothing. He didn't need to. Everything fit now. The switched wine glasses. The sedative. The urgency. Richard had intended to incapacitate me long enough for signatures to be manipulated or delayed, while legal control transferred elsewhere. Not murder. Something colder. Calculated theft. I looked up. You knew. Walter's jaw tightened. I suspected. Why didn't you stop it? His face hardened with something close to shame. Because Eleanor instructed me not to interfere unless Richard acted first. I stared at him. That's insane. No, he said quietly, it was evidence. And I understood. Mother had wanted undeniable proof. Not suspicions. Not accusations Richard could charm his way around. Proof. The kind no court or family could dismiss. Walter opened another folder. There's more. He removed a flash drive. Your mother recorded a statement to be played if Richard attempted to obstruct the will. I stared at it. When? 2 weeks before she died. She was barely conscious. She insisted. That sounded like Eleanor Carter, too. Dying had irritated her mostly because it interfered with her plans. Walter inserted the drive into his laptop. The screen flickered. And suddenly my mother was there. Smaller than I remembered. Her hair gone from treatment wrapped in one of her silk scarves. Her face pale, fragile. But her eyes. Those sharp gray Carter eyes. Still entirely herself. She smiled softly. Hello, darling. My breath caught. I had not heard her voice since the funeral. For a moment I forgot how to breathe. She looked directly into the camera. And somehow directly into me. If you are watching this, then I was right about your father. Her smile faded. I hoped I would be wrong. She paused, gathering strength. Then she spoke with the same calm authority she had used all my life. Richard Carter loves legacy more than people. It is his tragedy, not yours. Tears burned my eyes. I did not let them fall. On-screen mother continued. If he has betrayed you to protect Preston, know this was never about your worth. It was about his weakness. Her expression softened. Your father was raised to believe men inherit value simply by being born. He never understood that character must be earned. She leaned slightly closer. And you, Abigail, earned yours every day. I swallowed hard. Walter looked away, giving me privacy. Mother's voice grew firmer. The company is yours because leadership belongs to the person most capable of stewardship, not the loudest son at the table. Then she smiled again. That beautiful, infuriatingly wise smile. And if Richard is hearing this after attempting something foolish, well, your father always did learn best through consequences. Even through grief, I almost laughed. Classic Eleanor. Then her expression changed. One final softness. Forgive him if he repents, but never surrender truth to make a man comfortable. The screen went black. Silence filled the room. Walter closed the laptop gently. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then my phone rang. Detective Mercer. I answered. His voice was grave. Commander Carter, your father regained consciousness. A pause. He's asking for you. I looked down at my mother's letter resting in my lap. The ink shimmered slightly beneath the lamplight. Her final lesson. Consequences first. Forgiveness only if earned. I rose slowly. Tell him I said, my voice steady, I'm on my way. Because for the first time in my life, Richard Carter was about to face the one thing he had never truly believed in. Accountability. Charleston Memorial's intensive care floor was unnaturally quiet when I arrived. Hospitals have their own version of midnight even when the clock says 8:30. The fluorescent lights flatten everything into stillness. Voices lower instinctively, footsteps soften. People become careful around suffering. The nurse at the station recognized me immediately. Commander Carter. I nodded. He's awake, room 12. There was something in her expression, professional concern edged with curiosity. News traveled fast in Charleston, especially when it involved Richard Carter. For 30 years, my father had been one of those men whose name opened doors. He chaired hospital fundraisers, endowed university wings, sat on half the city's meaningful boards. Men like Richard build reputations so polished that people forget to ask what lies beneath. I thanked the nurse and walked down the hall. Mother used to tell me that hospitals stripped people down to their truest selves. Illness removes performance. You become who you are when control disappears. I wondered which version of Richard Carter was waiting for me behind that door. The answer came the moment I stepped inside. He looked old. Not distinguished, not powerful. Old. The sedative had left his face waxy and slack. His silver hair, always combed with military precision, lay flattened against his skull. Monitors tracked his pulse with indifferent beeps. For the first time in my life, my father looked mortal. He turned his head slowly when he saw me. His eyes settled on my face. And in them I saw something I had never once seen directed at me before. Uncertainty. Abigail. His voice was rough. Not the clipped, commanding baritone that had shaped my childhood. Just a tired old man's voice. I stayed near the foot of the bed, You wanted to see me." He swallowed. His throat worked painfully. Then he asked the question I already knew was coming. "Did you switch them back?" No greeting. No concern. No denial. Straight to the truth. I folded my hands behind my back, old military habit. Yes. He closed his eyes, and in that instant something inside him seemed to collapse more completely than his body had on Walter's office floor. When he opened them again, the certainty that had defined him all my life was gone. "You knew. I noticed you switched them first." A long silence stretched between us. Then he gave a faint, humorless laugh. "Your mother was right about you." There was no bitterness in it. Only exhaustion. That surprised me more than anything. I stepped closer. "Why?" He stared up at the ceiling. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried 30 years of old failures. Because Preston would have been ruined. The simplicity of it landed harder than any excuse could have. Not because he denied what he'd done. Because he believed that explanation should have been enough. I waited. Eventually he looked back at me. There are things a father owes his son. I felt the old heat rise in my chest, that familiar childhood ache of never quite measuring against expectations written for someone else. But I was no longer 10 years old, desperate for his approval. And he no longer had power enough to wound me with it. "What about your daughter?" His face tightened. He looked away. That was answer enough. I should have felt anger. Instead, I felt something colder. Recognition. This was who Richard Carter had always been. Mother had simply been the only person strong enough to stand between his failures and the rest of us. And now she was gone. He cleared his throat. "Walter told you." "Yes." His jaw flexed. "She transferred control to you." "She did." Another silence. Then he said quietly, "She knew what I'd planned. She knew who you were." That landed. He flinched almost imperceptibly. "Good. Some truths deserve impact." He closed his eyes again. "When your mother and I married, I thought I understood strength." His voice had changed. Lost its edge. I thought strength was command, authority, legacy. His fingers twitched weakly against the blanket. "Then you were born." I said nothing. He opened his eyes and looked directly at me. "You frightened me from the beginning." The words hit harder than accusation ever could have. I frowned. "Why?" "Because you never needed my approval." He gave a tired smile. "Even as a child." Memories surfaced suddenly. 8 years old, climbing the old oak behind our house after he'd forbidden it. 12, refusing to quit sailing after he said girls embarrassed themselves trying to compete. 17, informing him not asking that I'd accepted Annapolis. Every act of defiance had horrified him because none had required permission. He saw my understanding register and nodded faintly. "Preston needed me, you didn't." His voice cracked. "And weak men resent what they cannot control." There it was. The first honest thing my father had ever said to me. And somehow that honesty hurt more than all his years of criticism. I looked out the window toward Charleston's harbor lights blinking in the dark. Mother had known this too. Known it and loved him anyway, though not blindly. Perhaps love was sometimes simply seeing clearly and staying long enough to give truth one last chance. Behind me, Richard spoke again. "Your mother left another letter." I turned sharply. "What?" He nodded toward the bedside drawer. "She gave it to me the morning she died." I crossed the room and opened it. Inside lay a sealed envelope. My name in Mother's handwriting. Beneath it, another line. "Open this only after Richard tells you the truth." My pulse quickened. I looked back at him. His face had gone pale again, not from illness but memory. She knew exactly what I'd confess. Of course she did. Eleanor Carter had always seen people as they were, not as they pretended to be. I broke the seal carefully and unfolded the final page my mother had ever written. The first line made my breath stop. "If your father has finally told the truth, then perhaps our family can still be saved." I looked up slowly. Richard was crying. The first tears I had ever seen him shed. And for the first time in my life, I believed redemption might actually be possible. For a long moment, the only sound in the hospital room was the steady electronic rhythm of my father's heart monitor. A machine was measuring what pride had nearly destroyed. I looked down at Mother's letter again. Her handwriting remained as graceful as ever, every stroke measured and deliberate, as though even death had not been allowed to rush Eleanor Carter. I kept reading. Abigail, if Richard has admitted what he has done, then he has taken the first honest step of his life. That matters. A tightness settled in my throat. Mother had never confused forgiveness with surrender. She believed deeply in consequences, but also in the possibility of change. That had been her great strength, and perhaps her greatest burden. The letter continued. You come from two kinds of strength, mine which endures quietly, and his which must finally learn humility before it becomes wisdom. If this day has come, then both may yet become something worth passing forward. I lowered the page slowly. My father was still crying. Not dramatically, not theatrically. There was no audience left to impress. The tears moved down the deep lines beside his nose and disappeared into his pillow. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Not because illness had diminished him. Because truth had. And truth always makes pride look small. He swallowed hard. She wrote that knowing what I'd done. She wrote it knowing who you were. The words should have sounded cruel. Instead, they felt clean. Necessary. He nodded weakly, accepting the wound. Then he looked toward the dark hospital window. I loved your mother. It was such a simple sentence. And somehow the saddest thing I had ever heard. Because I believed him. For all his failures, Richard Carter had loved Eleanor in the only way he knew how. Possessively, imperfectly, often selfishly. But genuinely. The tragedy was that love had never made him brave enough to become better. He gave a broken laugh. She used to tell me I spent my whole life mistaking admiration for love. That sounds like her. A faint smile touched his mouth. Yes. He closed his eyes briefly, gathering himself. Then he looked at me again. There's more you need to know. I waited. His jaw tightened. Preston didn't know about the sedative. That surprised me. I must have shown it. Richard gave a hollow laugh. Don't mistake me for nobler than I am. He knew I intended to delay the reading somehow, but he didn't know how far I'd go. That mattered. Not because it absolved Preston, but because it changed the shape of his guilt. There are men who commit evil, and men who drift into cowardice because stronger men teach them how. Preston had always seemed more weak than wicked. Mother had known that too. Richard continued. He panicked when I collapsed. He truly didn't know. I thought back to my brother's face in Walter's office. The confusion had looked real. The fear had too. And underneath both had been something I had not recognized then. Shame. My phone buzzed. Walter. I answered immediately. His voice sounded unusually urgent. Abigail, you need to come to the office. What happened? Your brother is here. I straightened. What does he want? Walter hesitated. Then, he's brought financial records. My father's eyes sharpened. The old intelligence was still there beneath the exhaustion. He knows. I ended the call. What records? Richard's expression turned grim. If Preston has brought them voluntarily, then Eleanor's final lesson has already begun. I stared at him. What does that mean? For the first time all evening, something like respect entered his gaze. She knew exactly how he'd break. Walter's office looked much as we had left it, except now Preston stood at the conference table with both hands braced against polished walnut, staring down at a stack of folders. He looked terrible. His expensive hair was disheveled. His tie hung loose. His face had gone gray around the mouth. When he saw me, he didn't posture, didn't sneer, didn't accuse. He simply looked tired and frightened. Walter stood beside the windows, watchful but silent. Preston exhaled shakily. I owe you an apology. I said nothing. He gave a bleak laugh. Yeah, I know, that's not nearly enough. He gestured toward the folders. These are everything. I crossed the room and opened the nearest file. Bank transfers. Shell vendors. Internal approvals. Months of concealed losses. $11.3 million. Exactly as Mother had written. I looked up. Why bring this now? He swallowed hard. And suddenly he looked not like the polished Charleston air Richard had sculpted, but like the insecure younger brother who used to cry when father criticized his sailing form. Because Walter showed me Mom's recording. That stopped me. Walter spoke quietly. She instructed me to show it to Preston if Richard's actions endangered the family. I looked back at my brother. His eyes were wet. What did she say? His voice cracked when he answered. She said she knew I'd spent my life trying to become the son Dad wanted. He looked down. And that she was sorry none of us had taught me being loved and being approved of weren't the same thing. Silence filled the room. Then he looked up at me. And for the first time in 35 years there was no rivalry in his face. Only honesty. I'm tired, Abby. The old nickname sounded different now. Not patronizing. Just familiar. Human. I don't want to be him anymore. And in that moment I realized Mother had done something extraordinary. Even from beyond the grave she had not destroyed this family. She had given it one final chance to tell the truth. Walter folded his hands. There is one matter still unresolved. I looked at him. He met my eyes steadily. The board convenes tomorrow morning. He placed Eleanor Carter's final legal directive on the table and said quietly, Your mother's last public statement will be read aloud to all of Charleston's most powerful men. The boardroom at Carter Maritime Logistics had always smelled faintly of polished oak cigar smoke and old money. Even at 9 o'clock in the morning, the scent lingered in the paneled walls, as if the room itself had absorbed generations of Carter ambition. I had not set foot there in nearly 12 years. Not since the afternoon Father had laughed when I suggested modernizing the company's naval freight security systems. You're very good at military things, Abigail, he had said, while 6 board members smiled politely. But business leadership requires a different temperament. Mother had sat quietly at the far end of the table. She said nothing until later that night when she came to my room with chamomile tea. He fears competence he cannot control, she had said simply. I understood now how completely she had. The same men who had watched my father dismiss me all those years ago were gathered again around the long mahogany table. Most were in their 60s and 70s. Charleston bankers, shipping executives, retired judges, the sort of men who still wore cufflinks to breakfast and believed dignity meant never raising your voice. Their expressions were carefully neutral when I entered. But curiosity sharpened every eye. News of Richard's collapse had spread quickly. And Charleston loves scandal almost as much as it loves tradition. Walter stood at the head of the table beside the projector screen. Preston sat halfway down, pale but composed. For the first time in his life he looked relieved not to be the center of attention. Richard's chair sat empty. The absence carried its own authority. I took my seat opposite it. The symbolism was not subtle. Walter cleared his throat. Thank you for coming on such short notice. His voice carried the crisp certainty of a man who had spent 40 years controlling difficult rooms. As executor of Eleanor Carter's estate, I am here to present her final directives. A few men shifted uneasily. No one interrupted. Walter pressed a button. The screen flickered. And my mother appeared. The room went still. Even now diminished by illness, Eleanor Carter commanded attention the way truly intelligent people often do without effort. She wore a pale blue blouse I remembered buying with her 2 summers earlier. Her scarf was neatly tied over her bald scalp. Her posture remained perfect. And her eyes, those clear steel-gray eyes, swept the room as if every man present had already disappointed her. When she spoke, her voice was calm and unwavering. Good morning, gentlemen. No one moved. She smiled faintly. If you are watching this, then I am gone, and Richard has likely made matters far more dramatic than necessary. A few startled glances moved around the room. Even now she could disarm a room with dry humor. Then her expression sharpened. Let us proceed plainly. That was Mother. No ornament once truth became necessary. For years, Carter Maritime has mistaken inheritance for qualification. Several board members visibly stiffened. Good. She continued. We have rewarded entitlement while overlooking discipline. We have confused familiarity with fitness for leadership. One older director shifted uncomfortably beside me. He had once told me women lacked the necessary steadiness for executive command. I wondered how his breakfast was sitting now. Mother looked directly into the camera. My son Preston has made serious financial errors under pressure to become the man his father demanded. Preston lowered his head. No anger. Only shame. My husband enabled these failures because he believed preserving the illusion of male succession mattered more than truth. Several men glanced sharply toward Richard's empty chair. Mother's voice remained even. That illusion ends today. A pause. Then, I hereby confirm Abigail Eleanor Carter as majority owner and acting chair of Carter Maritime Logistics. The room erupted. Not loudly. Charleston men do not erupt loudly. But chairs shifted sharply, papers rustled, murmurs surged like wind through dry leaves. Walter raised one hand. Silence returned. Mother continued. My daughter has spent 18 years earning command in the United States Navy under conditions none of you would survive for a week. That landed beautifully. One man coughed. Another adjusted his tie. I almost smiled. Mother's eyes softened. She leads because others trust her under pressure. That is the only credential that has ever truly mattered. Then her expression grew grave. If any of you object because she is a woman, I invite you to ask yourselves whether your daughters deserve a world shaped by your cowardice. No one moved. No one breathed. She had them. Entirely. And then came her final words. A son may carry your name. A daughter may carry your character. Choose carefully which legacy you deserve. The screen went black. The silence afterward felt holy. No one spoke for nearly 30 seconds. Then Walter folded his hands. As of this morning, Commander Abigail Carter assumes legal control of Carter Maritime effective immediately. He looked around the room. Any objections may be filed formally. No one moved. Not one. The men who had once dismissed me now studied their folded hands with profound interest. Finally, old Judge Halbrook cleared his throat. At 78, he was among Charleston's last true institutional powers. He looked directly at me. Commander Carter. His voice carried the weight of generations. Your mother was one of the finest women I ever knew. A pause. Then, we would be wise not to disappoint her further. One by one heads nodded. Not dramatic surrender. Something rarer. Respect honestly earned. Then the boardroom doors opened. Every face turned. Richard Carter stood there. Pale. Unsteady. But upright. A nurse hovered nervously behind him. He ignored her. His gaze moved across the room until it found me. Then he stepped inside and faced the board. For a moment, the old Richard seemed poised to reclaim control. Instead, he drew a long breath and said the words no one in that room had ever imagined hearing. My daughter is the rightful chair of this company. The room froze. He swallowed hard. Then looked directly at me. And I have spent most of my life being too proud to deserve her. No one moved. No one spoke. Because in Charleston, public confession from a man like Richard Carter was not merely apology. It was revolution. And as I looked into my father's eyes, I realized Mother's final lesson had worked. For the first time in his life, he was telling the truth without needing to win. When my father finished speaking, no one in that boardroom moved for several long seconds. It was not discomfort. It was reverence. Charleston has always understood the power of silence. The Old South may forgive many sins, but it rarely witnesses public surrender from men raised to believe pride is virtue. Richard Carter had just laid his pride on the table in front of every powerful man who had ever mattered to him. And he had done it for one reason. Truth. The nurse at his side looked ready to intervene if he so much as swayed. He ignored her completely. His eyes remained fixed on me. There was no demand in them now. No expectation. No plea for instant absolution. Only acceptance of whatever answer I chose to give. That more than anything else told me my mother had been right. Something real had changed. Walter broke the silence first. Mr. Carter, your statement is entered into the official record. Father nodded. Then, with visible effort, he crossed the room and placed both hands on the back of his empty chair. Not sitting in it. Just touching it, as if saying goodbye. He looked around the boardroom one final time. For decades, this had been his kingdom. The place where his authority was unquestioned. Where his words shaped fortunes and futures. Now his voice was almost gentle. Gentlemen, my wife built far more of this company than most of you ever understood. Several heads lowered. He continued. And my daughter has already proven more discipline than I ever required from the son I favored. No one interrupted. Even Preston sat perfectly still, his face pale with emotion. Father looked at him next. His voice softened. I failed you too, son. Preston's jaw trembled. Father gave a small, exhausted smile. I taught you that approval had to be earned from me. It never should have. For the first time since childhood, I saw my brother's defenses collapse entirely. He looked suddenly young. Not 35. Not polished. Just a boy who had spent his life chasing applause from a man incapable of giving love freely. His voice cracked. I'm sorry, Dad. Richard nodded slowly. So am I. Then he turned to Walter. I will sign whatever resignation papers are required. Walter inclined his head. They're prepared. Of course they were. Mother had always anticipated every possible ending. Father signed without reading them. The scratching of his pen sounded impossibly loud. When he finished, he set it down carefully and looked at me. No drama. No speech. Just a simple nod. The kind one officer gives another when command has changed hands. And somehow that gesture meant more than every apology he had spoken. Then he allowed the nurse to guide him quietly from the room. The door closed behind him. And Carter Maritime belonged to me. Bah. 3 months later, Charleston had settled into winter. The city wears December gracefully, the harbor sharpens, the air smells cleaner, the old homes along the Battery glow gold at dusk. Mother had loved Christmas. She used to fill our house with magnolia wreaths and insist on handmade bows because store-bought ones lacked character. For the first time in my life, I understood what she meant. Character always reveals itself in the details. And details had become my work now. Leading Carter Maritime was not unlike commanding a military unit. Discipline mattered. Clarity mattered. Trust mattered most of all. The board had adjusted faster than anyone expected. Competence persuades men more effectively than argument ever could. Within weeks, we had implemented new oversight systems, corrected Preston's financial damage, and launched the scholarship program Mother had outlined in one of her private notes. The Eleanor Carter Leadership Fellowship. Full tuition for South Carolina women entering military service logistics or executive leadership. Walter had cried when we announced it. He denied this naturally. At 76, Southern lawyers still consider tears a private legal matter. Preston surprised everyone most. He declined any formal company role and entered financial ethics counseling voluntarily. He rented a modest apartment downtown and took consulting work far beneath his old status. For once in his life, he was becoming himself instead of performing for someone else. And Father? Well, redemption is rarely dramatic. It is usually quiet repetition. Weekly therapy appointments, letters of apology sent without expectation of reply. Small efforts made consistently enough to become character. Every Sunday afternoon he visited Mother's grave alone. He never missed one. I know because sometimes I watched from a distance. He always brought fresh roses, the kind she loved. And he always stayed exactly 30 minutes, as if honoring an appointment she had kept for him even after death. On Christmas Eve he called. His voice was steady. Abigail, would you come by? I almost said no. Old wounds teach hesitation. But Mother's final lesson had not been about punishment. It had been about truth making healing possible. So I went. The house looked smaller somehow. Not diminished. Honest. Father opened the door himself. No staff. No performance. Just an aging man in a plain wool sweater who looked startled by how relieved he was to see his daughter. Dinner was simple. Roast chicken, potatoes, green beans. Mother would have laughed herself breathless at Richard Carter attempting to cook. It was terrible. We ate every bite. And afterward, as snow began falling softly over Charleston, a rarity Mother always considered magical, we sat quietly by the fire. At last Father spoke. She was the best thing that ever happened to me. I stared into the flames. Yes. He swallowed. I loved her badly. There was no defense in his voice. Only truth. And truth, I had learned, is where reconciliation begins. I looked at the man who had once seemed too proud to ever change. Then I thought of Mother. Her wisdom. Her patience. Her refusal to surrender hope even when evidence failed her. And I smiled. She knew. He looked at me, eyes shining. Then, for the first time in my life, he reached across the space between us and took my hand. If this story has stirred something in your own heart, some old wound, some unfinished forgiveness, some truth waiting to be spoken, don't wait as long as we did. Life humbles all of us eventually. The question is whether we learn from it in time to love better.